Hi guys, Olive here today to bring you the penultimate installment in my nearly complete series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. In case you've never seen an episode of this show before, or if you've never heard me talk about it before, it was a half-hour television program directed at kids, and every single episode was split into two different storylines. The first storyline was always an adaptation of a work from within the literary canon that was most frequently a book, but it could also be a short story, a play, an epic poem, a myth, a legend, a folk tale, anything along those lines. And then in the second storyline, we followed a 1990s era family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone. And whatever was going on with them in their storyline always related back to the themes found within the literary adaptation. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video, and I compare that episode to the work they took on within it. I highlight the similarities and differences between them and speculate on why the writers maybe made some of the choices they did. I give my opinion on whether or not the writers were faithful enough to the work in question to really do it justice. I look to see if they pulled any kind of moral message out of that literary work to communicate to the young audience of this show. And then finally, I ask the most important question of all. Did it make for an entertaining half hour of television? Today's video is a very special one. It's a very emotional one because at long last, it is time to discuss the final episode of Wishbone, the finale of the entire series, the last episode of the abbreviated second season. It's an episode titled The Roman Nose, and it takes on Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the start of this episode, Wanda and Ellen are looking at old photos of Joe in his younger years and expressing their disbelief that Joe will be entering high school the next year. But they know he is destined for great things. Just then, Wishbone smells something funny. A man knocks on the door and informs Wanda and Ellen that there's a broken gas line nearby, and for everyone's safety, they need to evacuate the area just for the next couple of hours. Wanda is, of course, concerned about her plant babies back at home, but also she wants to run down to the Chronicle because this is some hot local news that she wants to report on. She heads out and is soon followed by Ellen, Joe, and Wishbone, who decide to wait this out at the pizza parlor. Being driven out of his home reminds Wishbone of the epic poem, the Aeneid, in which the hero Aeneas and his people are in search of a new home. Their city of Troy was defeated by the clever Greeks, who hid inside a big wooden horse that the Trojans wheeled into their city. The Greeks emerged and conquered the Trojans, ending the Trojan War. All of this was overseen by the gods, watching the action and plotting the fates of the heroes from above. Up in that realm of the gods, Juno and Venus are bickering. Juno hates the Trojans, but Aeneas is Venus's favorite. Venus complains to Jupiter about Juno's vendetta, but he assures her not to worry. It's the fate of Aeneas to be driven out of his native land in order to settle elsewhere and become the founder of a great new empire. Venus uses this information to awake Aeneas, played by Wishbone, during the final attack by the Greeks. She urges him to flee the city. He wants to fight, but Venus dissuades him. It's then his turn to convince his father to flee with him, but his father declines, saying he's too old to run away from this. Meanwhile, the Talbots flee to the pizza shop, safe and sound. Most of the neighborhood is there, including David and Demont and Sam, of course, since it's her dad's place and she works there. The kids start talking about how excited they are to start high school. New people, new things to do, new adventures, even if it does involve more homework. The adults then start reminiscing about their high school experiences, all the fun and the embarrassing moments. In the adaptation of the poem, the gods continue to toy with Aeneas and his people. Juno creates stormy seas and endless problems, but Venus then directs them to Carthage. She says she'll have Cupid aim his bow at their queen, Queen Dido, so that she'll fall in love with Aeneas and take him in. It turns out Aeneas returns Dido's affections and lingers in Carthage for a very long time. But the gods knew that staying in Carthage was not meant to be Aeneas's destiny. He was destined for other things. So Jupiter sends Mercury to instruct Aeneas to leave immediately and go meet his true fate. Dido is unhappy about him leaving, to say the least, even though Aeneas tells her it wasn't his decision to make. Back at the pizza parlor, David takes his little sister Emily across the street to go buy a new coloring book. And David's mom and Joe's mom keep talking about their younger years, and they bring up the legend of the old stump in front of the post office. Rumor has it that that stump is special because apparently it's the only remains of the first oak tree planted on Oak Street in the town of Oakdale. And people say that if you sit down on it and close your eyes, you'll be able to see your future. Joe, Sam, and Wishbone have some time on their hands, so they head on over to see if that's true. They walk up to it and immediately see that there's something engraved into the wood of the stump. Fatum, which is Latin for fate. They sit down on the stump, they close their eyes, but they don't see anything. So instead, they just start talking about what they want to do in high school. Sam expresses that she definitely wants to study photography, maybe drama, and Joe is, of course, going to try out for the basketball team, but he's also considering taking up the drums, maybe joining the jazz band. All this thinking about the future, maybe the stump works after all. Fate is coming for Aeneas too, but before he goes to meet it, Jupiter arranges a trip to the afterworld so that Aeneas can speak with the spirit of his now departed father. His father shows him his future descendants, the mighty rulers of the Roman Empire to come. Aeneas, inspired, leaves to go meet his future. Enough about the future. Wanda comes to the pizza parlor with a relic of the past. At the newspaper office, where she was busy getting a piece about the gas leak ready for the front page, she found their old yearbook. As they're paging through it, remembering all the activities they once did, Wanda recalls that Damont's dad was president of the student council. Damont overhears this and seems kind of peeved about it, and he also doesn't have an answer for Ellen when she asks him what he wants to do when they all get to high school. Instead, he just leaves in a huff. The group of them also recalls that Ellen pushed for the school to have a trophy case big enough to showcase not just the sports team's trophies, but all teams' trophies, even the non-athletic ones. She also helped design that trophy case and build it. Somehow Joe never knew this about his mom, and he wants to go see that trophy case. So he and Wishbone head on over to the high school. Venus and Juno are at it again in the poem adaptation. Venus sees Aeneas safely to Latium, which is his final destination, but Juno adds in a complication: Prince Turnus. The king is initially very welcoming to Aeneas, saying that he is going to be the one to marry his daughter Lavinia. They'll join their lines and build a great new empire. But Turnus interjects, opposing handing over their kingdom to this complete stranger and reminding His Highness that Lavinia was originally promised to him. To settle this dispute, Aeneas and Turnus agree to have a series of competitions, meaning a couple of races and then a blinking contest to see who will come out on top. Of course, Wishbone as Aeneas easily wins, securing his destiny. And the poem adaptation within this episode concludes with a very brief, high-level overview of the Roman Empire and its legacy, how far it spread across the world, and what in our modern lives are relics of its greatness. When Joe and Wishbone arrive at the high school to look at the trophy case, they find Damont is already there. Joe walks up and sees a state playoffs trophy with Damont's brother's name on it. And Damont takes that opportunity to open up to Joe about how he has to hear about his brother's many accomplishments all the time at home, how great his brother is and how much of a letdown he is by comparison. He's going into high school feeling defeated already. He's always been the disappointment of the family, and he feels he always will be. So why try his best? Why play his best when he feels like his best is never going to be good enough? Through most of this, Joe just listens. But when Demont is done speaking, Joe encourages him to not think that way. Joe also feels a lot of pressure to succeed because his father was so accomplished before his death, but Joe can't worry about it too much. He also offers to work out with Demont over the summer so that they both can be ready for basketball tryouts come the fall. Maybe together they could have their own trophy in that exact case someday. Demont is really appreciative of this and subtly apologizes for giving Joe such a hard time over the years. The series concludes with Wishbone cuddled up on Joe's lap. Joe assures his pooch that there are a lot of changes coming, but through all of it, one thing will never change. The two of them will always be best friends. So let's talk about this episode, the series finale. Obviously, there's a lot of emotion and nostalgia going on in this one since it's wrapping up the entire series. So this one is a lot less focused on driving the plot of the real life storyline. Instead, they're trying to combine these two different elements of looking back and looking forward. So the adults are all thinking back to their high school years and all the good times, while the kids are looking ahead to what's going to be coming up for them in their coming years as they start the next chapter of their lives. The feeling of this episode is just so lovely. It is really a feel-good episode of Wishbone. You have all the characters from the neighborhood forced into the pizza parlor to wait out this gas leak, and they use that time to just enjoy one another's company. And then at the end of this episode, you have that full circle moment with Demont, who has been a bully toward Joe and his friends throughout most of this series. I think that was the first time that we as an audience really started to get a sense of why Demont has been acting out this whole time. And that moment was definitely a turning point in his relationship with Joe. You could really feel that because Joe showed him so much kindness and because they can relate to one another and that they feel like they both have a lot to live up to, I can really imagine that Joe and Demont from that moment forward would start to build a friendship and they would go on to become really good friends in high school, loyal teammates. Demont would kind of become more integrated into the friend group. And that really warms my heart, especially because in an earlier episode, it's also kind of hinted that he has a little bit of chemistry with Sam. So it's just really interesting to imagine what would have been for these characters if this show continued. Thematically speaking, it made a lot of sense to me that they chose the Aeneid to be the work that they focused on in this series finale, because that epic poem is all about fate and destiny. Leaving your home, leaving a world you knew to go into the unknown of the future, to seek out your life's purpose, to fulfill your destiny. There's a lot of similar messages when it comes to the kids going into high school. So I wouldn't say that this episode necessarily has a moral message, but there is definitely that consistent theme of fate and destiny. They even show the Latin word for fate on the tree stump. So I think that that was really well done. I think the two storylines meshed really well in that way. It's just that the overall vibe of this episode, as the kids say, it is so much different than that of the epic poem. I wouldn't call the Aeneid dark in the way that I would, say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame or The Phantom of the Opera, two other books that this series covered. I would call it heavy, in that it's weighty with importance. I mean, it's essentially the origin story for the entire Roman Empire. And it feels that way when you read it. There is a lot of war, death, vengeance, misfortune, drama between the gods. Like, it's a lot. But you wouldn't know that just by watching this episode. The moment that we first meet Wishbone playing Aeneas, the Greeks are busy attacking the city of Troy. But I feel like they kind of hand wave that away. They're encouraging us to forget about that because it's also the moment that Aeneas is setting out on his adventure. They focus a lot more on that than the devastation going on in the background. Aeneas's trip to the underworld is infinitely less depressing in this adaptation. The writers of this episode cut out the sad fate of Dido entirely, which is a change I do actually agree with. But also, I think the biggest change that they made that really served to lighten and the tone of the adaptation was that instead of an all-out war between Aeneas's army and the Latins that actually happened in the epic poem, instead, we get this silly series of competitions, these events between Aeneas and Turnus. In this adaptation, there's no Pallas, there's no Camilla, there's nothing about that last series of battles, there's nothing about Turnus begging for his life, there's nothing about Aeneas taking Turnus's life, which is how the entire thing ends. Just some really, really stark differences, especially when it came to those final books within the poem. I do need to give the writers credit. Earlier on in the adaptation, they did capture a lot of plot points that were present in the epic poem, and they represented them faithfully enough to be recognizable from the Aeneid. It's just that change in tone that I felt was so drastic pretty consistently throughout the adaptation, to the extent that I think anyone watching this episode, especially kids who might then later go on and need to read the Aeneid for school, I don't think this episode prepares kids or anyone who's going to go on to read the Aeneid for what actually is in store for them, and I think that's a really important part of a good adaptation. So again, thematically, I think the Aeneid made a lot of sense for the series finale, but I think they wanted the mood to be so light. I think they wanted it to feel cheerful and hopeful, so they changed a lot about the adaptation to match that. And I just don't know how well it worked in terms of the faithfulness of the adaptation. So I feel very conflicted about this one. I'm of two minds about it. Overall, though, I have to say that I really enjoyed watching this episode. I was a little worried that it would be really sad, but I think the real life storyline was so sweet and so heartwarming that it really soothed away the pain of letting these characters go, because it gave them such a wonderful send-off. I really appreciated that. And then in the adaptation, I love the way that the meddling gods were portrayed. We see them in this white heavenly room, and they're observing and manipulating things on Earth via this war table and these little figurines of everybody that they're moving around. And that war table is actually given some really cool special effects that have aged surprisingly well. A lot of Wishbone special effects age like milk when you go back and watch them, but not so in this case. And the acting in those scenes was fantastic. So I think we've got some positives and negatives when it comes to this series finale, but it gets a decent grade for me overall, definitely a passing grade. There's a lot more good here than bad. In fact, I wouldn't even say that the bad is bad necessarily. It's more like weird. So this episode is good, but it's also kind of weird, especially if you've just read the Aeneid and you can sense that tone shift. But overall from this episode, I got what I needed from it. So those were my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone, the last episode of Wishbone. If you have any of your own, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. And if you want to see more of these What's the Story Wishbone videos that I have done, I can use the past tense now, there is a playlist that I made of all of the ones that I have done. I have now covered every single regular episode of Wishbone. The only thing I have left to do is talk about the movie they made back in the 90s, which will be a bonus episode. But if you're looking for one specific episode, you want to hear my thoughts on it, or if you just want to start from the beginning and now watch them all because it is now pretty much complete besides that bonus episode, I will link that playlist for you below and up in the cards. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.